All right, hope you guys are doing good today. They actually forced me to do a waiting room. I didn't choose it, so I have to kind of keep looking over to the side to make sure there's no one sitting in limbo uh, over in purgatory waiting to join us. So today we're going to look at Unit 7, the last one, the really fun one where we get to talk about Darwinism and social Darwinism and imperialism and how that Boer War went and everything, and for Great Britain. So first we got to start off basically where we left off in 1848, especially in France. Remember, they elected a new leader to lead their second republic, Louis Napoleon, or who will be affectionately known as Napoleon III, once he becomes emperor in 1852. And so he was basically brought in because Europe turned ultra conservative. And remember, at this time, to be conservative means that very few people have the right to vote. It's not the same thing that it means today. Like conservatism back then was, very few people could vote. Extreme anti-Semitism was the norm at this point. And so Napoleon III comes to power, and a lot of it's riding behind like, okay, we don't want to become too liberal. Now, France was liberal, more liberal than Germany or Italy, but they didn't want to go too far down that road. So they kind of brought him in because they saw him as, well, first of all, his last name means everything because, Napoleon, no matter what that guy did, it's almost like he's like King Midas. Everything he touched turned to gold. Like, even if it was wrong, everyone would still be like, oh, yes, that's great job. I don't know if any of you have ever read through all of the Chronicles of Narnia, but there's in the voyage of the Dawn Treader, they come across these people called the Dufflepuds, and every time the leader speaks, all the other people just come along and like, oh, you said it perfectly, Chief, perfectly. Like, no one could have said it better. You're the best at everything. And every time he speaks, they always like encourage and say he's the greatest. Literally, France is like that with Napoleon. They're just like, oh, Napoleon, oh, he's the best, always the greatest. But so I digress. And so they bring him in. He's a figure that they know. They think it'll bring that uniformity in the country. And so he basically, there's a coup d'etat. He comes to power, and all is well in France. So 1852 to 1870, he is the leader of France. There's going to be a lot of economic growth during this time period, so that's going to make people super excited to be there at that point. You also have urban workers are supporting him because of the things that the government's doing to support the factories and the conditions under which they're working, so that they don't get as bad as they were, say, with Britain. And so things are going very well, and they end up, because he restricts the National Assembly, people begin to get upset. In fact, about 45% of the people begin to go against him and his rule and his reign, to the point where they forced a new constitution to be signed. France and constitutions are wonderful things. And so, that's basically the time period for France during this imperialism age, and things were going very well, and then they weren't. So they come up with a new constitution to kind of limit the powers of the government, to give more power back to the National Assembly, and to kind of balance everything. And so from that point forward, France will be reliant more upon like a parliament than they will be an emperor or a Napoleon. Which remember, 1870 is a big year for one country, and 1871 is a big year for another country. They might know who was unified in 1870? First
Italy.
time? Yeah, all right. And then 1871 is?
Germany.
Yeah, Germany. So those two countries are going to be unified for the first time in their history, and they will no longer be like these separately ruled places. Now, one of the biggest influences, socially speaking, is Darwin. Now, you all should know from past classes and everything, Darwin creates the survival of the fittest. He writes the book On the Origin of Species, and I forget the rest of the title. Like 6 more words though. It's like by the means of natural selection. I know it has to do with natural selection in the title, but it's a long book, 1859, and basically it's just this idea that there are certain qualities in animals that are going to lead them to survive and others to die out because they don't have those same qualities, and they'll change over time to help themselves survive. Well, along comes Herbert Spencer. You guys remember that name? This guy was responsible for taking Darwinism and applying it on a social scale. So in other words, the rich are the strongest or the fittest, and the poor are the weakest. So it's perfectly fine if, the poor just die out, or the poor have very few rights because they weren't strong enough to take those rights anyways. And so he applies that idea of the survival of the fittest to society, and that's not going to turn out very well, because what it's going to do is it's going to lead to basically a ton of racism from the 1870s all the way through, well, really today. You can find the seeds of it through today. Remember, it started with anti-Semitism, and then it went forward and it moved to the continents of Africa and Asia itself, because they would go into those places and tell them, well, you don't really know what you're doing. Let us share our great, well, let's just put it this way, whiteness with you, and we'll show you how you can be awesome just like us. And so you just have this huge idea of racism that's pervading Europe at this time, where if you're not European, you're backwards. And we're going to do our best. Because remember, the French thought, you know what, if we go down there, we can eventually turn them into French people. And the British thought, we can't turn them into British people, but dang it, we can get them as close as possible. And we can at least give them some idea of what civilization and perfection is. And so that's kind of how Darwinism plays out on a social scale, and this idea that Great Britain, France, Germany, really Europe was the ideal, the perfection, the perfect society, and everywhere else, well, we can help them along, but we'll see how great they can actually be. And so this social Darwinism is going to stretch out and be a lot of problems. Remember, you talk about Africa, you talk about Asia. In Africa, you have the Boer War, and you guys remember the chopping off of body parts and all of these things that we talked about. You go on and you talk about in Asia, leads to the Boxer Rebellion, and the treatment of the Chinese people through all of this. The way that they viewed the Japanese, the way that they viewed all of these different cultures that they came in contact with, was just from this ideal of being superior and being awesome and everything else. And so it's extremely racist whenever you apply Darwinism to actual society, and you're going to see a lot of problems kind of come along as a result. Just to kind of look at imperialism for a few moments. Remember, the British Empire was stretched vastly far around the world, and Africa became their new conquest. Remember, Egypt was very important to them. That Suez Canal, that connection to what it basically is Asia. And so they began to conquer countries around Egypt to make sure, like Sudan, to make sure that they could like have a buffer between them and other European countries. France would come into Western Africa and control large swaths of that. Britain would also go as far down as South Africa. In fact, they tried to set up a continental railroad that went from South Africa all the way up to Egypt, but the Germans stopped that. Because they controlled Central Africa, like the Congo and whatnot. And so you're going to see all of these different countries. In fact, from 1870, the map of Africa and like colonies or European influence that was in them versus 1914, within a 40-year span, you're going to see nowhere that's untouched by European powers. And so it's going to be very interesting time period for Africa. Like I said, France would control quite a few areas. And remember, the reason why they were doing this is because there was lots of natural resources there. You could find a lot of iron ore, you could find a lot of gold, you could find diamonds, you could find all sorts of things there that were extremely valuable and that people, well, obviously fought over. And so it was not like they were just doing it to spread their awesome community and their awesome ideals, but instead they were literally looking to gain as much as they possibly could. Remember that piece of that pie that no one else could have. Did we talk about J.A. Hobson out of curiosity? I can't remember if I included him in your notes.
I don't think so.
Okay. He was one of the people that kind of spoke out against imperialism. You don't really need to necessarily, well, maybe write down his name. Hobson is Hobson, but he spoke out against it, basically saying that imperialism, because the way that the countries represented, they were like, hey, look, if we go down to Africa and we conquer this whole area, you know what's going to happen? You as a people are going to get a whole lot more money. And that sounds great. They're like, oh, sure. But in all reality, the only people that actually benefited were the companies that went down there and spent the money. It's kind of like in a gold rush. The only people that actually get rich are the people who sell supplies to those who are mining for gold. Same idea. So whoever was funding all of this were the ones who got rich. And so it really didn't help the average citizen of the country who, like, for example, England. And so he kind of spoke out against it and said that it really didn't pay off for the country the way that they said it would. It was only specific individuals. And basically it brings you to the argument that the rich only get richer. And so that's Hobson kind of spoke out against that. You know, there was another voice that spoke out against imperialism, which shouldn't surprise you. Vladimir Lenin. He said, you know, it was like the most extreme form of monopoly capitalism that there was. He also believed that, he also made the statement that if they continued this idea of imperialism, it would be the end of capitalism as a whole. Whether that's true or not, we don't know because it's still around. And well, yeah. Let me make sure I get everything else. Yeah, that's about it for the criticisms. Imperialism, yeah, we talked about that. Going through all my notes right now. Yeah, it's about it. So yeah, there's just, remember, there was a lot of countries grabbing up a lot of land, whether it be in Asia, whether it be in Africa, and it was all under the idea that you know, hey, get as much as you possibly can. All of the natural resources will help us, so on and so forth. And yeah, so a lot of racism during that time period, if you guys remember, as we talked about, and lots of people looked down upon. Remember, it was fashionable. You know, you couldn't really be successful in politics unless you were anti-Semitic. So, and most of the people called them, said that they were anti-Semitic, but then some of their best friends were anti-Semitic. So not sure any of that ever really panned out the way that they thought that it would. But racism does become a major thing throughout Europe, and to be honest with you, it's still a huge thing today throughout the world. And a lot of that was driven by social Darwinism. So make sure that if the question is on social Darwinism, you are prepared with that kind of information. Now, a couple things before we are done. Number one, all of you should have gotten an email yesterday with your e-ticket for the test. I'm pretty sure it's supposed to walk you through like the things that you need to do before the test. Like there's a checklist. Make sure you do that today. Do not try to do it tomorrow or at 3 o'clock tomorrow. Do it today. Do everything so that you know that everything's working, everything's good to go. Again, you're going to have 4 p.m. You all need to set an alarm for 3:30. Make sure that you are at your computers no later than 3:30 so that you're ready to go. Plan an hour and a half. From 3:30 to 5, you're going to be sitting there making sure that you do this. Another thing you need to make sure you do whenever you're doing this, take little notes, like write down little notes on the side on a piece of paper, like write little notes down so that you can go. But remember, you get 45 minutes. So if you're someone like Kyle who plans out for a very long time and takes a while to write, you got to stay on point. You got to work, and you got to stay on task, on target the entire time. And last but not least, you guys will not have the same question. I've already talked with some people who took the APUSH exam yesterday. Very few people actually have the same question. They mix them up. There's multiple questions out there, so who knows what you're going to get. It could be from multiple time periods. We could all see different questions. Thursday we'll do a Zoom meeting. Obviously we won't be covering anything, but those of you who take it, let me know what questions you get, and we'll see what units they covered this year, just for fun. And yeah, so make sure you guys are ready, prepared. Make sure you've done everything on your end. Make sure your parents have paid for the test, so on and so forth. Yeah, good luck. Do you guys have any questions for me?
Not really.
Okay. Look, I know that you guys are more than capable. You will do fine. Don't panic. Daniel says, "What's up?" So don't panic. That's like your worst enemy. Don't get scared like right before you. Oh my goodness, what am I gonna? It's one question. Get over it. Remember, like go over all the information that we've gone over. How do you get the points? There's the 10-point rubric this year. I shared a video that breaks down the 10-point rubric. So if you know these things before you go into it, you'll be perfectly fine. Make sure you write a good thesis. Don't lose a point because you don't write a thesis. And remember, write your thesis at the beginning and at the end. Always restate your thesis at the end. Remember your sources that you use, the documents that you use, which we're going to use all 5, right? It's not 7, so it's not terrible. But the sources that you use have to prove your thesis. So you have to tie them into your thesis. So keep that in mind. Honestly, it should probably take you about 5 to 10 minutes to read all the documents, make your notes, and tie in, the documents that you want to use back into your thesis. And so I'm fully confident you guys will be fine. Just don't panic. Number one thing.
I have one question.
All right, go ahead.
So, for like the contextualization, how is that different from the 2 pieces of evidence? So do we need like 3?
Contextualization would be bringing outside information and tying it into that. So, if you're talking about the Reformation time period, and you want to bring in, so for example, the document talks about the 95 Theses, and you want to bring in another outside piece of evidence that kind of led Luther to that 95 Theses, or something that became a result of the 95 Theses. That would be contextualization, like bringing in something else that ties with this, but it's not mentioned inside the document. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So how is that different from like the other 2 specific pieces of evidence that we have to tie into the documents?
I don't. To be honest with you, I think they're just looking for as much outside information as possible, and so they're looking to give ways to give those points. So I don't think it's that much different. They're just, what I think. So, for example, I just gave you an example of what it would be like to use the document and then bring something to tie to the document. So when you're talking about outside pieces of information, I would be talking about something later on down the road. So for example, or even before, so I could bring in how the printing press went a long way to the Reformation happening, because now Bibles could be made on a grander scale. And so the word of God could be given out in more places. So that would be, nothing in the documents would have tied to this. And so I bring in his printing press. And so boom, that's the outside information. So something that doesn't tie to the documents would be what that's referring to. Hopefully that makes sense. All right. Any other questions? All right. Well, good luck tomorrow. If anyone needs to come to my house to take the test tomorrow, you're more than welcome to do so that you can stay on point and you can make sure that you get it done, get it turned in, are ready to go at 4 o'clock. My door's open. Just, shoot me an email or something to let me know that you're going to be here so I'm prepared. But yeah, so if whatever it takes to get you guys to do well, I will do it. All right. If you have any questions and you don't want to ask them here, that's fine. Email me, do something. I want you to feel as confident as you possibly can as you go into this tomorrow, and enjoy.
Enjoy.
Enjoy. Yes, it's an experience. Like, it's a life experience. Like, don't look at it as like the worst thing that's ever happened to you in your life. It's something you can learn from. So enjoy. Life is about learning lessons. Whether you pass or whether you don't pass tomorrow, either way, you've learned something. Or at least you have the opportunity to learn something, I should say. I don't know if you will, but there's the opportunity is there. All right. All right. Well, if you guys don't have anything for me, I'm done.
Okay.
We'll see you guys on Thursday.